In the last step, we got an overview of Swagger and OpenAPI. In this step, let's focus on generating the documentation for our REST API. The library, which we'll be making use of to automate the generation of our API documentation, is called SpringDoc OpenAPI. If you do a Google for SpringDoc OpenAPI, you should see a web page like this come up, spring.org. I'll open this up in one window, and I'll also open up the GitHub page for it. So github.com/springdoc/springdoc OpenAPI. Let's go in there. So I've opened up the website, as well as I have the GitHub page for SpringDoc OpenAPI in here. Now, if you look at the SpringDoc OpenAPI website, you'd see that this is a Java library that helps us to automate the generation of API documentation for Spring Boot projects. The SpringDoc OpenAPI works by examining the application at runtime to infer the API semantics. This is done based on Spring configurations, your class structure, and the annotations that you are making use of in your REST API. A very important thing to remember is that this supports OpenAPI 3. And the current live version of SpringDoc OpenAPI only supports Spring Boot v1 and v2. If you look at our pom.xml, you can see that we are making use of Spring Boot 3. So how can we get SpringDoc OpenAPI with support for Spring Boot 3? That's where we'll go to the GitHub page. If you go to the GitHub page of SpringDoc OpenAPI, if you go to the branches which are present in here, right now, the master version is what is being used to support Spring Boot 1 and Spring Boot 2. The 2.x branch in here is what is being built to support Spring Boot 3. So what we want to make use of is the 2.x version of SpringDoc OpenAPI. And the specific thing that we would want to make use of is Spring OpenAPI Starter WebMVC UI. So you can see a number of folders in here. One of them would be Spring OpenDoc Starter WebMVC UI. So if you go in there, Spring Doc OpenAPI Starter WebMVC UI, and you go to the pom.xml of this, this is the specific artifact that we would want to add in. At this point, you can see that there is no released version for 2.0.0 yet. So what we'll do is we'll make use of the latest milestone release in here. So the group ID is as is. So the first thing we would need to add in our pom.xml. So let's go to our pom.xml, and I'd add this below validation, starter validation. I'll type in dependency, and over here I'll paste in the group ID. The artifact ID I would make use of is SpringDoc OpenAPI Start WebMVC UI, and the version I'll be making use of is this specific thing. I don't want to use the snapshot version, so I'll use a M4. So 2.0.0-M4 is what I'm going to make use of. I expect this to be changing very, very frequently. So what I'll do is I'll create a text lecture before this lecture where I'll make the entire text of this dependency available. So you can copy the entire dependency text from there and just paste it in, and you can be sure that that specific version would be working with Spring Boot 3. Now I'll go ahead and save this, and you can see that the dependency is now being downloaded. So that's good. So the dependency is being downloaded because we are making a change in the pom.xml. What we need to do is to stop the server and give it a little bit of time to make sure that everything is downloaded. Once everything is downloaded, you can go in and start up your server again. The application is up and running, and I can go ahead and type in localhost 8080/swagger-ui.html. So this would take you to the Swagger UI, and you can see the documentation for our REST API in here. We have created two resources until now, a user resource and a Hello World resource, or the Hello World controller. And as part of the user resource, we have the following actions defined. You can get users, you can create a new user, you can get the details of a specific user, and you can delete a specific user as well. And as part of the Hello World controller, we have three simple REST API exposed. A Hello World REST API, a Hello World REST API with a path variable, and a Hello World REST API returning the bean back. That looks good. If you actually see at the top, you would see a link to /v3/API docs. I can do a right click in here and I can say open link in new tab. And this would take you to the Open API specification for our API. You can see that this is a JSON document. So I'll minimize everything which is present in here. So we have info, servers, paths, and components. And you can see that we are making use of OpenAPI version 3.0.1. Info has the generic information. So you can have a title for your API and you can also define a version for your API. In servers, you have information about where your API is exposed at. So the server location is what is present in servers. In paths, you have details of all the resources that are being exposed. So you have a number of resources in here, /user, a specific user. You have hello world path variable, and hello world bean. And in components, the schema is defined. How does a user object look like? This would have a ID field. This would have a name field. You can also see that there is a min length and max length that is being defined in here. This is captured based on our validation, which is defined on the name. We said name has a minimum length of 2, and that's what is being shown in here. And you also have birth date in here. So the schema for each of the objects is present in here. You have the schema for hello world bean as well. In the hello world bean object, we have a property called message. It's of the type string. So that's components. Components is basically where the schema of each bean is defined. And in paths, you're defining the resources and the actions that you can perform on those specific resources. So this is /users. On /user, you can perform get action and the post action. Get will retrieve the details of all users, and post would create a new user. You can go to get and see all the details in there. You can see that the operation ID, this is basically the method where the code is defined. This is retrieve all users. You can also see all the possible responses. You can see that the expected response is 200. If I minimize get, I can go to post. And you can see the details for the post request. This is to create a new user in here. You can see that the request body for a post request should contain application JSON in the format of the user bean or the user schema component in here. And you can also see that this is required. Request body is required for executing a post request. I'll minimize the post in here. If you go to user/ID, in there, you can also see an extra thing called parameters. There is an ID field which is needed. So over here, we're defining that we need an ID in the path variables, and it should be an integer, and it is required. Even for a specific user request, we are defining a response. The response should be of the type user. So in your OpenAPI specification, we define our REST API. What are the resources? What are the operations that can be performed? How can you send a request in? What is the response that you can expect back? And Swagger UI provides a good UI around your OpenAPI definition. So I can go in here and I can explore this in a visual way. So I can look at the specific user's request and I can see that there are no parameters which are expected. And the expected response is of this format. You have a list of users that are being returned. And for each of the user element, you can expect an ID, name, and a birth date back. If you want, you can go ahead and try it out as well. I can go ahead and say try it out. And this would not have any parameters, so I can go ahead and say execute. And you can see the response coming back in here. You can see that there are 3 users coming back, Adam, Eve, and Jim, and you can see all their details as well. You can also see the response headers which are coming back in here as well. So the OpenAPI definition provides a API definition for your REST API, and the Swagger UI helps you to visualize it and also play with it. Let's minimize the get. Similar to the get, you can see all the details about the rest of the APIs in here as well. So you can create a new user, you can get the details of a specific user, delete an existing user. And for each of the actions that you can perform on the REST API, you can look at the request format, the response format, and a lot of other things. In this step, we made use of Spring Doc OpenAPI to generate documentation for our REST API. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time, and I'll see you in the next step.